So let's keep going. The roots, principles, and themes of postmodernism. Like all intellectual movements, postmodernism emerged in a specific social and political context. To understand the modern context from which it emerged, however, we first need to understand a bit about the past. Among other things, we need to understand the role skepticism, or a questioning attitude, has played in shaping history since the 1500s, when Christianity splintered into different sects during the period known as the Reformation. These new groups all challenged both the old ways and each other. By the end of the 16th century, treatises against atheism also began to appear, which suggests that some people in that era had even stopped believing in God. Up until this time, most scientific knowledge in the West had come from the ancient Greeks. But in the 1600s, medicine and anatomy underwent a revolution, and Europeans quickly learned a lot about the human body. Other revolutionary advances were made in mathematics, physics, and astronomy. Collectively, these developments played a crucial role in the rise of enlightenment thought, which broke away from the then dominant religious narratives and spread throughout Europe in the 1700s. This enlightenment thought included the liberal ideas and principles on which modern Western societies came to be based. These developments, in turn, led to the emergence of the scientific method in the 1800s, which was centered on skepticism, questioning conventional wisdom, and the need for increasingly rigorous testing and falsification, the process of attempting to prove things false. A series of rapid developments in the early 1900s, including increasing political volatility and eventually war across Europe, contributed to changing ideas about class and gender and gave rise to a strain of thought and art that came to be known as modernism. Products of this philosophical, artistic, and cultural movement include a strange mixture of pessimistic skepticism about reality and progress and a focus on subjectivity, with an overly confident belief in the individual and universal truths and the potential of innovation. By the middle of the 20th century, a number of profound social and political changes had happened in a very short time. The First and Second World Wars shook Europe's confidence in the notion of progress and made people wary of the power of technology, since it had been used to commit so many atrocities in the wars themselves, in Nazi Germany and under communism, the official state ideology of the Soviet Union based on the revolutionary socialist ideas of German philosopher Karl Marx. Left-wing intellectuals across Europe grew suspicious of liberalism and Western civilization, which had allowed the rise of fascism, a totalitarian and authoritarian ideology, in Germany, Italy, and elsewhere. At the same time, the horrific effects of communist ideology in the Soviet Union during that period could no longer be denied, even by those on the political and cultural left. The same could be said for colonialism, which was no longer seen as morally justifiable or defensible, as European colonies such as British and French colonies in Africa, Asia, and elsewhere successfully fought for and gained independence. Meanwhile, technology and the mass production of consumer goods fueled a renewed hunger for art, music, and entertainment after the strict rationing and deprivations caused by the Second World War. This sparked conservative fears that society was degenerating into an artificial, hedonistic, consumerist world of fantasy and play, while significant social justice activism was met with other types of fears and hostile resistance. In the United States, for example, the civil rights movement that began in the 1950s reached its peak in the 1960s, with African Americans fighting for and winning equal rights under the law, despite often violent opposition. On the heels of those important victories, activism by and on behalf of women and lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender LGBT people took hold and slowly began to gain broad cultural support. Throughout this period of turmoil and transition, more people from around the world started to migrate to Western countries, prompting those in the West to gradually pay more attention to racial and cultural inequalities, and particularly to the ways in which the structures of power had contributed to them. At the same time, science's role in enabling, producing, and justifying the previously impossible horrors of the preceding decades was interrogated as well. In this context, there was a shift in how many scholars and academics in the West came to view the world and its systems. From a belief in human progress based on science, reason, and liberal principles, to a belief that everything should be eyed with suspicion and skepticism, including the very tools that had led to unprecedented human progress. Put another way, Modernism gave birth to postmodernism.
So really what they've done here, they've taken us on a whirlwind tour of the ancient world and different modes of thought and being and conflict and progress that led us up to the point where postmodernism took the stage. It's interesting because there is a form of progress that happens just like when you learn new things, and the new things that you learn enable you to learn even more new things. There's a building upon with each new generation of new forms of knowledge, new ways of establishing knowledge, and that it's the proof of its validity is the new things that it allows you to do. And at the heart of this, I think, is something that I love expressed in Jurassic Park.
I'll tell you the problem with the scientific power that you're using here. It didn't require any discipline to attain it. You know, you read what others had done, and you took the next step. You didn't earn the knowledge for yourselves, so you don't take any responsibility for it. You stood on the shoulders of geniuses to accomplish something as fast as you could, and before you even knew what you had, you patented it and packaged it and slapped it on a plastic lunchbox, and now you're selling it. You want to sell it. Well,
I don't think you're giving us our due credit. Our scientists have done things which nobody's ever done before.
yeah, but your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should.
And I feel like that one thing that came to the forefront in the wake of the world wars, where we saw the nuclear weapons of mass destruction and the death and the power there, and then looked into the future and asked ourselves there's that famous quote from Einstein that I don't know what weapons will be used in World War III, but I know that sticks and stones will be used in World War IV. There's a real moral quandary and moral existential crisis that I can see at the heart of this intense skepticism. But the skepticism isn't just confined to in what direction should we point our scientific progress and what ethical principles should we use to guide our scientific process. Rather, it questions the very foundation of that scientific process in and of itself.
It brushes over it. It won't go into it very long, but I talked about it last time. But this is half mentioning the critical theory side of the whole genealogy, which this book doesn't go into very much. James Lindsey spent a lot of time in it afterwards. But that skepticism of capitalism and even the progresses of capitalism, everything right down to like jazz music becoming part of capitalism, that side of the critical theorists, that this little section brushed past them because that's the part of post-war all the way up to the postmodernists. So you got the 40s, 60s, up to the 70s, more when these guys are around. They were a different side, a different school that's part of the genealogy of the final cynical theories that this book's talking about.
Critical theory is aimed at changing circumstances that enslave human beings, liberating or emancipating people who are oppressed. This critical perspective sprang primarily from Marxism and the works of Marx and Engels, which focused on the analysis of class relations in capitalism, noting that workers, the proletariat, are oppressed by those who own the means of production, owners, or the bourgeoisie. And as workers gain consciousness of this oppression, they should revolt. Marxism asserts that modes of production, the reality of economic production, influences other social structures, which together enforce class oppression. The ontological assumptions of critical theory arise from historical materialist understandings of Marxism. Critical theory's ontology is rooted in historical realism, asserting a virtual or constructed reality shaped by power dynamics, including social, cultural, political, and economic forces. The more narrow use of the term critical theory relates to Marxism, specifically to a set of Marxist philosophers who were part of what was known as the Frankfurt School, and stretching from about 1929 with early proponents Horkheimer and Adorno to the late 20th century and later proponents Marcuse and Habermas. While the Frankfurt School eventually died out, critical theory writ large has continued to survive, influencing and including any philosophical approach with practical aims to improve conditions for the oppressed, such as feminism, critical race theory, and some forms of queer and post-colonial theory.
But the postmodernists developed over in France. Those guys were a different group that developed in Germany and then came over to the United States. But it does fast breeze by that.
It's almost sounding to me like they're saying that postmodernism was a reaction and an overcorrection of the critiques of modernism? Because they very briefly mention a critique of modernism, as they say, that it was overly confident in the individual and universal. And that's definitely something that I noticed in being in a pretty high demand religion. And they were definitely very overconfident in what would be universal. So they say everything we have to teach is universal. Everything within our doctrine, if lived by these principles, everybody would be better off. And then postmodernism seems to take that and turn it on its head and say there's no such thing as universal. Like, it's like being the irritating vegan that says everybody needs to be vegan, and then turning around and saying that there's no universal truth, not even everybody needs to eat, or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, there's a criticism of liberalism and modernism itself that also comes from that religious side, that pre-modern side that says your liberalism and pluralism and openness to ideas is always going to tumble down into this. And so the liberalism was the acid that can contain, or you guys opened the Pandora's box that was always going to lead to this. And it's a criticism worth considering, because part of one of their ideas is we had the center thing that we were all in a maybe tyrannical way centered on, and it kept us together. And your pluralism and openness to new ideas and devolving into atheism is what was always going to lead to this. And me as a liberal, I think these guys too with the book can always say, no, it didn't have to go that far. The answers to those extreme critiques can still be found within liberalism itself.
And you're pointing to this weird mirror image that exists in this, where early in this history, when they're talking about the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution that accompanied it, where part of that was an intense skepticism of all of the established norms and all the power structures that existed at that time. The difference is that skepticism, the filter, the thing that allowed them to answer their questions about what was real and what was not real, was this scientific method where you used the notion of a shared objective reality to distinguish things that were actually true from things that weren't. And the seed of that, of being able to sift through all the different claims of knowledge and pick out and advance the claims of knowledge that best matched reality based on empiricism and the scientific method, was the germinating seed at the root of the progress that happened. Because when your fund of knowledge better reflects the truth about reality, then you're able to take advantage of that technology, whether it's agriculture, engineering, even weapons, or whatever thing that your society relies on. You're going to do better, you're going to advance. And then you fast forward to the moment where they're questioning this new modern world that we have, and they've introduced a new form of skepticism. But that skepticism is rooted in some real ideas in terms of where are the limits on what human progress can do. Is the claim of the goodness of this human progress actually mapping the reality of the human experience? But there's no real world arbitration of how to sift those things out. And so it blows the world open for that skepticism to have no bounds. And whereas scientific skepticism has the boundaries of objective reality when challenged through empiricism, this new form of postmodern skepticism has no way to contain it. And you accompany that with this skepticism towards meta-narratives, and that you allow even the way that we understand the world to be called a meta-narrative. The systems that have led to that progress, led to a better understanding of the real world, itself is a meta-narrative that not only should you be skeptical of, but potentially discard, is I think where the danger is in adopting this new form of skepticism. Any other thoughts on those two forms of skepticism and how they seem to be related but different?
I think modernism, enlightenment values, science, all that stuff are sandwiched between two different anti-real levels, the pre-modern and the postmodern. And there's a lot of similarity in the things that they're complaining about, but these are some of the same thoughts that these very theorists were thinking about. Like on the critical theory side, what they claim is liberalism can't hold. The center can't hold. They just can't stay there. The Marxist historicism is really just future telling, saying that no matter what, this liberalism is going to fall into a a communistic state. They think that they have to advance it and make it happen faster, but they think it's going to happen no matter what. But the critical theorist side of it said, no, it could teeter one way or the other to fascism or to communism. And so there's a big struggle that really mirrors a little bit the entire World War II struggle. And you had communism, fascism, in the middle of it, liberalism.
Oh, I think it's interesting really about this early original postmodern movement that you might be tempted, I think, looking back now to say, oh, it was purely a leftist movement. They just wanted to demonize capitalism and liberalism and try to advance socialism and all the other stuff. When you say, no, they actually, because the truth about the devastating death, famine, and totalitarianism of Stalinist Russia, of Lenin's revolution, they had to also confront that. And that maybe that put them over the edge of saying, if none of these grand narratives about the way that society should exist are real, maybe we should discard all of these meta narratives. And so it's not really tilted to the left or right so much as it's just like blowing everything up.
That's always one of the critiques that they'll say about it, is like they were actually critics of Marx, but if you listen to it, they criticize capitalism as something that should be, liberalism and capitalism is something that should be abolished and completely skeptical of. And Marxism we should be skeptical of it, but we can save it in some sort of way or do it better, do it a little bit this way. The postmodernists were less vocal about that than critical theorists for sure thought that they could do it better. But the postmodernists still left that level in there. There's just like a sense that if you're reading it, like the Nietzschean thing that they ran with so hard that every single philosopher, they show their desires at the bottom of it. And the way they tried to refine or say, man, Marxism could have just worked, might have just worked, maybe there weren't all these issues. But they expose in it that there's capitalism, liberalism, bad, must be obliterated. Marxism, beautiful idea, maybe it's not going to work because of this and this and this and that sort of thing.
So they go through the philosophical exercise of trying to fix or correct or improve Marxism, but they don't extend that same exercise towards liberalism.
For sure, on the critical theory side, on the postmodern side, they might even just show that I feel like there's like a show-off contest of who was the most disillusioned with Marxism because they'd hoped it would be the savior, but it didn't quite do it. And then they don't really try to resolve it as hard.
When you're talking about liberalism being sandwiched in between the pre-modern world and the postmodern world, what is it that held the pre-modern world together? Well, you have these claims of authority and power exercised by the church. The power that the church held was contingent upon it having divine or having that religious divine spark of truth at its core, at its foundation, at its center. And then when you explode that with the Enlightenment and people using scientific method, using intense skepticism about those claims of power, allowing them to change, for example, the geocentric model to the heliocentric model, and the resistance that came because it directly attacked the claims of religious truth that were entrenched in that pre-modern world. And I feel like the postmodern world has basically said the only thing that exists now is power. Since we've discarded our ability to use objective reality to adjudicate claims of truth, and those claims of truth give you a form of power, then we're just going to say that there's no way to know any truth, but what that then justifies any movement or any political action is whoever has the power is the one that actually is justified by nature of them using that power to take power.
Absolutely true of Foucault, who probably was the champion, like he was the winner out of all of them. It's the stuff that people ran with the most. Again, people throw sand in your eyes and say, but other postmodernists critique that as like a big meta narrative that also answered stuff. But the Foucauldian view of it's all just power definitely won out from that period.
All right, let's see here. Postmodernism is radically skeptical of just about everything. It's skeptical of science and other culturally dominant ways of deciding what is true, and of the grand sweeping explanations that support them. It called those meta-narratives, a kind of cultural mythology that in the eyes of postmodern thinkers demonstrated how short-sighted and arrogant humans are in thinking that simple narratives could explain the world. Postmodernism didn't invent skepticism, but it took it to extremes by doubting that there was any such thing as knowable truth that was not thoroughly embedded in cultural norms and beliefs. According to the reason and science-based thinking that came out of the Enlightenment, on which more than 2 centuries of human progress have relied, however, objective reality can be known and discovered. Indeed, we built our modern world using knowledge about objective reality produced by the scientific method, and we continue to do so today. In the postmodern view, though, reality is the product of our socialization and lived experiences as constructed by systems of language. The sociologist Stephen Seidman recognized this change in thinking in 1994. Quote, "A broad social and cultural shift is taking place in Western societies. The concept of the postmodern captures at least certain aspects of this social change." Close quote. Walter Truett Anderson, writing in 1996, put it more strongly. Quote, "We are in the midst of a great, confusing, stressful, and enormously promising historical transition, and it has to do with a change not so much in what we believe, but how we believe. People all over the world are making such shifts in belief. To be more precise, shift in belief about belief." Close quote. What Seidman and Anderson are describing here are changes in epistemology, that is, changes in how we obtain and understand knowledge.
Okay, I want to stop right there because epistemology is one of those polysyllabic words that when you are first exposed into this, it hits you in the face. What does that mean? You hear somebody use it in conversation and you're supposed to know what it means already. And you're like, yeah, I know what that means. But it's pretty important because it gets to the foundation of a lot of this stuff. What is epistemology?
Epistemology is the study of knowledge, what we know and how we can know it. Epistemology focuses on the nature of knowledge and its scope. Different perspectives on epistemology argue that knowledge is gained in different ways, has different levels of reliability, and can or should be utilized differently. Epistemology is considered its own storied branch of philosophy, and most Western philosophers have contributed to it. Epistemology focuses on questions such as, what can we as human beings know? How do we gain such knowledge? And what does it even mean to know something? As the study of knowledge, which is often the desired end of research, epistemology is important to understand and clarify as a researcher.
All right, that wasn't too bad.
That was good.
I think
Okay.
sort of the center of that is the study of truth. And one of the things I point out a lot in this section is ways of knowing, right? And that's something I've ran into a lot is we're starting to blur the lines between there's no superior method of knowing. You can have that video Science Must Fall. The girl in South Africa trying to explain that the scientific method is an invention of colonialist white supremacists.
How do we even start to decolonize science? Because science is true because it is science. And, what can you do? And my response to that was, if I personally were committed to enforcing decolonization, science as a whole is a product of Western modernity, and the whole thing should be scratched off, especially in Africa. So if you want practical solutions to how to decolonize science, we'd have to restart science from, an African perspective, from our perspective of how we've experienced science.
Like there's a witch doctor that says that he can cast a spell on somebody and they'll be struck with lightning. And how do you know that's inferior to scientific method? And one dude in the crowd just stands up and exacerbated. It's one of my favorite moments on YouTube. And he just goes, because it's not true. And he's so flabbergasted that he even has to explain that.
For instance, I had a question for all the science people is, there's a place in KZN, in Mkabialingana, and they believe that through the black magic, you call it black magic, they call it witchcraft, others, that you are able to send a lightning to strike someone. So can you explain that scientifically? Because it is something that happens
He gets shouted down for inferring that this white supremacist system of gaining knowledge could possibly be superior to gaining it through spiritualism or whatever it was she was talking about.
Yeah, you're definitely getting canceled for that little segment.
We're already canceled. It's part of one of the deals of the whole entire thing. And then this is one of the big words that it's so hard to say it to people, and they think you're suddenly using a big word. But at the same time, we're talking about something so important is, do you believe I can know things? I believe you can know things. And so you start trying to talk to people like that. There's people who clicked off of this video from the start because we're three white guys talking about it. That's for sure happened, probably, especially if we're talking about this in like a negative way. The concept of knowing is, are we talking about the actual material or the actual ideas in the world? Do they have any truth to it? Or is it already suspect because it's us talking about it? That's an epistemological problem and question. And this little portion talked about how since 94, 94 even earlier, we've been in this. It's like it started then and it's just overtaken. We're in a postmodern era, whether we like it or not. People view things this way, and they didn't have to read Foucault for it to take over the whole entire Western world's way of starting to see things. Not that everybody does, it's halfway there, but so many people have this Foucauldian view of doubting who can know stuff and why. And it came in through school, movies, Hollywood, music. The ideas have been around us and surrounding us for quite a while. We're in a postmodern era.
It's funny because everybody inherently does want a way of knowing that is reliable, dependable, and objective. And you could just ask yourself, if you are accused of a crime, then suddenly a way of knowing that is empiric, that is based in rationality, that has some defensibility becomes very important, because you don't want somebody else to be able to make an accusation and then have the fact that they have a particular identity be the thing that determines the truth of their accusation. You want to have some sort of objective external way of adjudicating between claims that are truthful and claims that are false. And I think that's something that when you look at it from that perspective, you say there's real importance, but we've actually departed from that in this postmodern world. And that's where that intense skepticism is being applied, not just to things like capitalism and liberalism, but also to science and empiricism and the idea that evidence and rationality have any power in filtering truth and getting us closer to a knowledge of truth. And the danger of that is summarized in that question of, if you're accused of something, do you want those accusations to be sifted between true and false or not? Because that's a lot of the stuff that we have in cancel culture, and what people have is that accusations suddenly become very powerful in destroying your life, destroying your livelihood, destroying your reputation, and the psychological wounds that come along with your society demonizing you.
And so a true postmodernist would critique this and say that when we talk about different ways of knowing, a true postmodernist would say they're all absolutely equal. There's no ranking. There's no ranking any of it. And somebody who tries to rescue postmodernism might say that the people who went and took it to next levels went back to ranking. And so they'll say a critique of like, oh, it's not true postmodernism because they came up with their own new ways of ranking. And true postmodernism, not that it's that much better, but it's just flat. They're all equally good and equally bad.
Just the identity politics aspect of it. That's the source of truth. Because in practice, they do seem to, like you said, this will be dismissed because we're three white guys. I just had that the other day where somebody talked about women being oppressed in this certain group. And I said, oh, how is that? And I got, oh, of course, a white guy is asking for proof. Of course, I'm asking for proof. You're leveling an accusation at an entire subset of people. And so I'm like, what's your proof? And the identity part of that, yeah, you're right. It's not that true postmodernism would say that it's all level, it's all equal. But when they get fused into the theory is when your identity precludes you from contributing to this truth because of power structures.
So epistemology, as we're going to interact with it in our current day, is going to involve different ways of claiming and defending truth. What are some of the ways that we're likely to encounter now? One of them is going to be what we're used to in the scientific method. So is that best labeled empiricism, where you believe that there's an objective reality, You believe that we all can learn truths about that objective reality. And you believe that while we may all have our own biases when we try to understand that objective reality, there's a method whereby we can use experiment and evidence and rationality to sift through bias and understanding to try to get something that is more approximate to a true understanding of the world. And so those rules all come together under this idea of empiricism. And that's in a way of establishing truth. So when somebody says you did X, Y, or Z, you can take those rules of empiricism that we may use in the objective world and apply them in an interpersonal situation and say, what is the evidence that you have that I did X, Y, and Z? And then we use those same tools of logic and rationality to sift false from untrue claims through that. Now, well, you know,
gaslighting me. Don't ask for evidence.
Yeah.
okay, so that's one way of knowing. And that would explain why you would ask, why do we want to show some evidence? And we've seen that even in the Evergreen debacle, where you've got a college in one of the most progressive cities in America who's got one of the most diverse campuses, and the faculty and students have all latched onto this idea that there's this huge racism problem that is infiltrating their campus. And it becomes the subject of all of these faculty meetings. And one particular professor stands up and says, where's the evidence of this racism? And he's told in that moment, the fact that you're demanding evidence is itself racist.
I was at this meeting. We were discussing the question. There were all of these allegations about white supremacy at Evergreen, and every so often somebody, sometimes it was me, sometimes it was somebody else, asked about, okay, where's this white supremacy? Can we see it? Can we evaluate it? And this faculty member said that, she said, to ask students who are suffering from white supremacy to tell us about the instances of white supremacy is itself racism. And she said, we must stop asking them because we are inflicting harm on them, asking for evidence. And the phrase she used, she said, to ask for evidence of racism is racism with a capital R. I sat up in my chair and I said, are you talking to me? And she said, yes. And I looked around the room and nobody said a word. And I said, you know, at some point, you might want to check into whether or not my history lines up with the accusation of racism, because you might be very surprised. And if you don't look into it, it's going to come back to bite you. And the chair of the faculty said, Brett, this is not the place to defend yourself against accusations of racism. And I said, that's fine. Where is the place? And then the faculty member who leveled the accusation says, you should not expect a place to defend yourself against accusations of racism. And I looked around the room. The president of the college is sitting there. The provost of the college is sitting there. Nobody says a word. And I said, whoa.
The fact that you're demanding evidence is itself racist. And that doesn't make sense to you until you realize that there's different ways where truth is being established for these claims. So what is that frame of truth? If it's not empiricism, because evidence is not part of the calculation, what is it?
Called standpoint epistemology.
What is that? What is standpoint epistemology?
Standpoint epistemology, this is getting into later theories. I'm pretty sure the book gets into it.
Section, I think.
But it's that your positionality, or the position of the person and the identity of the person, holds more truth and understanding, and as a way of knowing that has as much, if not in occasions more validity to it than something that can be falsified.
And is there a seed of truth to that? Most ideas that hold sway and capture people's imagination have some element of truth to it that reflects why it's so appealing, or is it simply because it's useful and you can gain the upper hand?
I think there's a qualitative truth to it in the sense of somebody's emotional reaction to something is going to be a standpoint epistemology that, like, it is true that I had this emotional reaction to this thing, and There's no way of falsifying that. There's no way of me saying, no, you didn't. So your emotional reaction to the thing or your perception of the thing, it is true that was your perception or your emotional reaction to the thing. But it doesn't hold a lot of water jumping into the objective reality beyond the objectivity of your perception and your reaction.
Just blur the lines between truth and perception of truth. They don't really blur the lines. They just, it's almost as if the perception of truth just is truth.
It's a maneuver to make subjectivity objectivity. I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah.
And that's really powerful when you talk about taking offense, because suddenly your ability to take offense at something that somebody said, it makes it that they actually did intentionally offend you, or they did aggress upon you with their words. And we'll get into the equation of words and violence later on, but just because of your subjective sensation of that. And we know that people can learn how to be offended by things by learning new ways in which something might be interpreted as being offensive.
Well, they straight up you're on that your attention doesn't matter at all. It's all about how it's perceived. That'll get it.
That's one name that I get into in this book, which is the Roland Barthes Death of the Author, which is legitimate in the art world, where when an artist puts something out, in some sense, they have offered their artistic product to the world, and it's up to the world to decide what it means. And there's some truth in that. You as the viewer or participant in that art, take something from yourself and blend it with whatever the piece is and come out with new meaning. And it's legitimate because for you, it's the combination of you and the work of art. But in the real world, when you're trying to get along with other people, intention does actually matter. And you just do that golden rule flipperoo where you say, do I want people to take into consideration what I'm intending when I say things? And I think most people would agree, yes. That doesn't mean that you don't have a responsibility to be selective in the words that you use and try to make sure that they reflect your intention, or be aware of ways in which they may be misunderstood. But when it comes down to it, there's a connection between your intention and what is said.
There's a critique in all this, and the book is going to point to it. It's the very next chapter, which I guess we'll do next. But there's some people who might say the postmodernists, or even Roland Barthes, who was a structuralist, they were maybe just talking about it in the art world, or in the world of words, or in the world of a text, or maybe Foucault or maybe Derrida were just giving a warning more than making it normative, making it a way you should be. But then there's the applied postmodernists, which come later, who say, we're going to take this as a cookbook and a recipe book on how to interact with people and bring it into the world.
I think for this section, we just wanted to focus on what is epistemology. And we wanted to lay out that there's not just one way of knowing things in the way that these ideas are evolving. And that's part of what we're going to learn later on, is that people claiming different ways of knowing are going to take footholds, and they're going to change the landscape. Because what it does is it essentially changes the rules by which everybody interacts with everybody else. And that's part of what we're trying to understand.